Did the midnight bells of Christ Church drown out her final plea for mercy? He stood within the carnage of Miller's Court, a silhouette in polished leather, watching his own reflection in a pool of crimson, while the world outside remained blissfully unaware. Long before the blood ran through the gutters of the East End, he walked the halls of the elite. A man of medicine, or perhaps a man of God, he hid his growing rot behind the starched collars of a gentleman. The obsession began with a single dark curiosity that the drawing rooms could not satisfy. He traded his top hat for a commoner's cap, descending into the filth of Whitechapel to hunt for a feeling the sun would never allow. August brought a heat that made the stench of the East End unbearable. In the early hours of the 31st, the Ripper found his first mark in Buck's Row. The blade moved with a silent, terrifying grace that left no room for screams. The morning light revealed a horror the Metropolitan police were not prepared to solve. As the bells tolled, the man responsible sat in a nearby tavern, listening to the frantic whispers of the morning commuters, while the iron remained hidden in his coat. 8 days later, the darkness returned to Hanbury Street. He didn't just kill, he took trophies, proving to himself that he was the master of the human machine. The city was no longer just a hunting ground, it was his personal theater. London went dark as thousands of gas lamps were extinguished by fear. Men stayed indoors, and the women of the street began to walk in pairs. Yet the Ripper knew that fear was a poor shield against a man who knew every shortcut. September 30th was destined to be his masterpiece. Frustrated by a near interruption in Dudfield's yard, he moved toward Mitre Square with a cold, renewed fury. He had 45 minutes to turn a mistake into a legend that would never die. The square was a silent stone trap tucked away from the main thoroughfare. In the time it took a constable to walk his beat, the phantom had rearranged the world. He vanished before the echoes of the law's footsteps reached the corner. He stopped in a doorway to clean the evidence of his night's work. With a piece of chalk, he scrawled a message that mocked a nation's prejudice, leaving the police to argue over his words while he slipped back into luxury. A package arrived in the mail that made even the hardest men of Scotland Yard recoil. It wasn't a joke. It was a piece of the harvest. He sat in his study, tasting the iron on the air, feeding the fire with his secrets. Fear turned neighbors into enemies. Every man who carried a black bag was hunted through the streets by angry mobs. The Ripper watched from the safety of his carriage, a wolf observing the sheep as they tore each other apart in his name. For weeks he remained dormant, allowing the terror to simmer. The police claimed he had fled or died, but he was simply waiting for the fog to thicken. He was a predator who understood that anticipation is the cruelest weapon. By mid-October, Whitechapel had become a ghost town before sunset. The phantom walked the center of Commercial Street, unchallenged and unhurried. He relished the vacuum he had created, a king ruling over an empire of boarded windows and bated breath. Inside the walls of Lemon Street Station, the air was thick with failure. Detectives argued over blood-stained aprons, looking for a monster with claws. They never suspected the man who shared their taste for fine tobacco was standing just outside their gates. He returned briefly to his world of velvet and silk, attending the opera while the East End bled. He watched the elite shiver with a thrill, knowing he was the source of their delicious terror. The headlines were his evening entertainment. The luxury of the West End began to feel like a cage. The voices began to itch at the back of his mind. He needed a finale, a display of such calculated brutality that it would never be forgotten. He reached for his steel. He descended once more into the filth, drawn to the worst street in London, Dorset Street. He watched the shadows of Miller's Court, waiting. Mary Jane Kelly was humming a song of home, unaware of the visitor leaning against the damp wall. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest, the brightest, and the last. She invited the phantom into her room to escape the rain. The door clicked shut. The legend was about to be sealed in blood, and the world outside was locked away. She offered him a seat by the fire, a final act of kindness. He laid his coat across the bed, his mind already dissecting the silence. The door bolt slid home with a metallic screech. They spoke of the rain while the fire crackled. She saw a gentleman. He saw a biological puzzle. Every word she uttered was merely a heartbeat closer to the end. He'd peeled an apple, the skin curling like a ribbon. The firelight projected their shadows onto the peeling wallpaper. The Ripper stood up slowly, his shadow looming over hers like a dark premonition. He was no longer a man. He was the personification of the city's rot. For a moment, a flicker of something human returned, a memory of a sunlit garden and a life before the voices. But the darkness was a jealous master. It reminded him that his purpose was to reveal the world's hidden, bloody machinery. The clock in the distance struck 2. The time for pretension had passed. He reached into his duster coat, his fingers finding the cold, familiar embrace of the surgical steel. The air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves gasped. He didn't move with anger, but with the terrifying calm of a craftsman. Every motion was a ritual performed 1,000 times in his mind. The room became a cathedral of shadow, and she was the final offering to his distorted god. In those final seconds, London felt like a living thing breathing with him. He was the scalpel, and the East End was the wound. He believed that by this act he would finally become immortal, a name whispered until the end of time. The voices finally fell silent as the work began. He moved with a speed that defied the darkness, turning a squalid room into a monument of his own making. In that hour, he was no longer a man. The deed was done. He stood amidst the ruins of Room 13, the metallic tang of the air thick enough to taste. The Ripper looked at his hands, finding them transformed. He had finally carved his name into the very bones of London. As the gray light of morning touched the rooftops, he walked away. The thrill was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching cold. He realized that the legend would live forever, but the man would fade into the fog, a nameless ghost of his own design. The files were closed. The letters stopped. The world moved on, but the shadow remained in the corner of every dark alley. He was never just a man. He was the dark reflection of a city that refused to see its own heart. Nobody will ever know his true identity. Was he a nobleman or a drifter? All his crimes are well documented, and London still shakes in fear when his name is murmured. Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel butcher. Is he true crime's greatest mystery?
Like and subscribe for more true crime.